Who is ERICH Shivara? He was born October 12, 1889, the same year as Martin Heidegger, Gabriel Marcel, and Adolf Hitler. Interestingly, 1889 was also the year his fellow Jesuit, Gerard Manley Hopkins, died. His place of birth was Katowice, which is located in Upper Silesia, then part of Germany, now present-day Poland. He was one of 3 boys. His father was a merchant of Polish ancestry, while his mother was German and came from a family of civil servants. He attended the local gymnasium, where his preferred classes were music, most especially the composers Johann Sebastian Bach and Franz Liszt. Shivara writes, "Music as form is the real birthplace of what I later took up as polarity, the center of my thinking," end quote. In June 1908, after finishing his schooling, instead of attending university, Shivara decided to enter the Society of Jesus. This was a determined and bold move because the anti-Jesuit laws of 1872 were still being enforced within the German Reich. These laws were part of the larger, disastrous policy of Otto von Bismarck to drive the Catholic Church out of power in Germany after his victory in the Franco-Prussian War. This policy of Bismarck has come to be referred to as the Kulturkampf, meaning the cultural struggle between the Prussian state and Catholic Church. Due to these laws, Shivara would have to leave home and attend one of the 2 Jesuit novitiates of the exiled German province. His novitiate was thus in Exeter, Holland, and was followed by years of study in Valkenburg, Holland. His studies were divided into 3 periods. The first 3 years were given over to philosophical studies, followed by 3 years of ministry work, where Shivara taught music at a preparatory school in Austria, ending with 4 years of theological studies at Valkenburg. One thing that should be noted about the uniqueness of Shivara's studies at Valkenburg was that this place of study was a rare exception to the sawdust and manualist Thomism prevalent in most of the seminaries of that time, in that it encouraged a dialogue between medieval and modern thought. Shivara says about his teachers at Valkenburg that he learned to, quote, study in pure objectivity without pastoral or apologetical secondary goals. Each author, regardless of how anti-Christian or anti-religious, to understand them better than they understood themselves, and thus to begin a dialogue with them, end quote. Shivara was ordained to the priesthood in 1920 and returned home to offer his first Mass. And like so many poets, philosophers, and theologians of that time, he was touched to the core by the unspeakably terrible event of World War I. Thomas O'Mara keenly observes that, quote, perhaps that experience also prompted a personal, lifelong attention to the realities beyond words and symbols. Real life and humanity placed demands upon speculative philosophy and theology, end quote. And it cannot be denied that Shivara was always attuned to the signs and currents of the times, as well as the concrete grounding of both his philosophical and theological thought. And this concern gives his thought a perennial freshness. What then was the young Shivara to do upon finishing his theological studies? The obvious answer, to embark upon an academic career. But pursuing an academic path during Shivara's time was difficult for 3 reasons. First, the Jesuits were just returning to Germany after their expulsion by Bismarck. Second, there was a tradition or discrimination in Germany that the theology faculty was taken from the ranks of diocesan clergy rather than from the religious orders. Third, Przywara was under suspicion for possible modernist ideas due to some of his previous publications. And in light of these factors, Przywara was sent to the Jesuit journal Stimmen der Zeit in Munich. Przywara would serve on the editorial board from 1922 to 1941. The goal of this extraordinary journal was, in the words of O'Mara, the expression of the Catholic faith and spirituality and German philosophy, art, and religion, end quote. During this time, Przywara would publish countless articles and reviews, as well as give some 344 public lectures, while at the same time teaching numerous short courses at various universities, along with giving talks and retreats. However, by the time of the early 1940s, Przywara's health was beginning to be undermined due to his excruciating heavy workload and austere lifestyle, although surprisingly, his production slowed little. Meanwhile, things were growing dark in Germany. In January 1933, Hitler became Chancellor, and by 1934, Reichsführer. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws against the Jews were enacted, and by 1939, World War II began in Poland. Hence, the very world which Przywara inhabited was on the brink of destruction. The Nazis put an end to Przywara's teaching and publishing. As Christian Lager states, since he was a respected and greatly appreciated dialogue partner of so many significant philosophers and theologians of his age, the Nazis viewed him as a leading intellectual propagandist of Catholic action, end quote. The Gestapo shut his Jesuit house and he lived alone as signs of his oncoming illness began to manifest themselves. 1941 saw his first entrance into a clinic. Interestingly enough, it was the Carolinum, the school of the Dominican Sisters of Speyer, where Przywara's intellectual friend Edith Stein taught. O'Mara remarks, the priest who had appeared to possess energy without limits became anxious and incapable of work, erratic, a condition only heightened by the opinion of others that it was partly psychosomatic. Nevertheless, Przywara remained an outstanding critic of the Nazis during the war years, and one example of this is his sermons given in Munich and Vienna in 1943 and 44, in which he propounded the importance of the Jewish scriptures for Christianity. Himmler himself attended one of Przywara's evening lectures, but saw them as too intellectual to be overly dangerous. Coupled with being a strong critic of National Socialism, Przywara was a tremendous support to numerous people during the war. In the post-war era, Przywara returned to writing. After 1945, Przywara published in the neighborhood of 20 books and some 200 articles. Opinions vary on the depth and quality of the later work of Przywara. O'Mara sees much of Przywara's post-World War II writings as disjointed and repetitive of themes present in Przywara's early work, while Karl Rahner thinks that Przywara's later work holds great potential. This view of the relevance of Przywara's late work is echoed by Kenneth Oakes and Joseph Ratzinger. And although it is true that Przywara's later work fills out in a more poetic and theological manner his more metaphysical earlier work in a much needed and fruitful way, the Analogia Entis is and remains, in my view, Przywara's magnum opus. But the importance of the late works should not be understated. What then precisely was Przywara's illness? In this matter, I have been unable to find any conclusive diagnosis as to the precise nature of his illness. General consensus seems to be that both psychological and physical elements interlaced in Przywara's illness. There were periods of great productivity and clarity, as well as long periods of inactivity and depression. Jean-Luc Marion compares Przywara's brilliant and painful destiny to that of Friedrich Hölderlin, while O'Mara says, with the Nazi extinction of the House of Stimmen der Zeit, PRZYWARA had lost his moorings, lost his place and charismatic vocation. In the widest sense, his world was gone. He had written that Jesuits should be spiritually homeless in an ecclesial spirituality for the world, and eventually he was to suffer that condition deeply. End quote. PRZYWARA died September 28, 1972 in Hagen, overlooking the glorious alpine landscapes. He was buried in the Jesuit cemetery at Pollock, just outside of Munich. It is more than an understatement to say that PRZYWARA was a prolific writer. He has somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 publications, 50 of which are books. My purpose in this section is to briefly show the amazing variety of topics engaged by PRZYWARA, while also highlighting the themes of his major works. Prior to delving into a survey of PRZYWARA's work, a few words should be said concerning why PRZYWARA's works have not been readily translated into English, as were the works of his contemporaries, such as Rahner, Guardini, Karl Adam, and Augustin Bia. The simple answer given to this question is the extreme difficulty of PRZYWARA's German prose and methodology. O'Mara describes PRZYWARA's style thus: the style, in fact, is Neoplatonic and pseudo-Dionysian, circling a sense where sources, opponents, motifs, and personal themes hover around the topic, leading to a synthesis. There is also the literary motif of crescendo, a rhetorical crescendo, end quote. While John Betts describes PRZYWARA's prose as idiosyncratic, dense, and logical, von Balthasar describes it as flaming and expressionistic. Therefore, it is easy to see why translators have shied away from PRZYWARA's works. Up until 1914, only 2 books and 2 essays of PRZYWARA were translated into English. Thus, 1914 marked a much-needed watershed moment in English-speaking PRZYWARA scholarship with the appearance of the translation of PRZYWARA's 1962 edition of Analogia Entis by John Betts and David Bentley Hart. The translated books prior to Analogia Entis are Polarity, a German Catholic interpretation of religion, and The Divine Majesty, and the latter is only a partial translation. PRZYWARA's output was truly outstanding, as were the scope and span of his intellectual interests. PRZYWARA was a thinker deeply imbued with the living stream of the great tradition of Western thought, a tradition which, with all his energy, he sought to bring into conversation with the deeply cultural, spiritual happenings of his times, be they in music, art, literature, poetry, philosophy, or theology. PRZYWARA then was a thinker of extraordinary integration and conversation, who sought to broaden the borders of various disciplines in order to bring them into dialogue with each other, thereby presenting a polyphonic vision of reality. And this is why PRZYWARA wrote not just about philosophers and theologians, but writers and poets as well. Hence, one finds him in conversation with many of the great Catholic novelists of his generation, such as Julian Green, George Bernano, Graham Greene, Sigrid Undset, and Gertrude von Lefort, as well as poets such as Paul Claudel, Rainer Marie Rilke, and Friedrich Hölderlin. Yet PRZYWARA did not just write on poetry, but composed poetry himself. Indeed, he describes himself to Lefort as largely a poet. And in view of the importance that PRZYWARA placed on literature and poetry as partners in dialogue with philosophy and theology, he must be seen as one of the first continental thinkers to pave the way for that wonderful and fruitful trend in continental philosophy and theology, which has turned to poetry and literature as original and deep aspects of the manifestation of the truth of being. This aspect of PRZYWARA's thought also must have no doubt greatly influenced von Balthasar, in his theological paradigm shift and turn towards aesthetics and literary figures in his theological aesthetics. Turning to Przywara's work of the 1920s, we see Przywara working out a metaphysical philosophy of religion in dialogue with the early thinkers of phenomenology, Husserl, Scheler, and Heidegger. Przywara's early work, Way to God, written between 1922 and 1926, wrestles with the personal journey of humanity's discovery of God. In 1923, Przywara's book on Scheler and Newman would appear. This work is largely a dialogue with Max Scheler and is an expression of Przywara's lifelong conversation with thinkers of intuition, from Scheler going back to Newman, Pascal, and Augustine. Turning to Polarity, 1927, which is arguably Przywara's most important work of the 1920s, one finds a philosophy of religion which opens itself out into a Catholic theology of revelation. This book can be seen as the forerunner to Analogia Entis. In 1929, Przywara published a book on Kierkegaard. Przywara reads Kierkegaard as a central figure with whom all philosophers must secretly or openly struggle with. In 1930, Przywara's book on Kant would appear, where he presents Kant in a metaphysical light, similar to Heidegger's Kant book, which appeared 1 year before Przywara's in 1929. In 1932 would appear Przywara's magnum opus, Analogia Entis. And here I am convinced with John Betts that this work is the greatest work in Catholic metaphysics in the 20th century. In 1938, Przywara published a colossal 3-volume elucidation of Ignatius's spiritual exercises, entitled Deus Semper Meor. Here Przywara enacts a wonderfully fruitful re-engagement with Ignatian spirituality, thereby showing its importance and relevance for 20th century humanity. There is also a 900-page survey of the Western tradition titled Humanitas, written in 1952. This work covers thinkers from Heraclitus to Thomas Wolfe, as well as a metaphysical anthropology entitled Mensch, 1959, 2 major works on biblical exegesis, and 2 significant ecclesiological works. This is just touching the surface of some of the magisterial writings of Przywara. As Betts succinctly states, simply put, there is no German Catholic theologian of the first half of the 20th century who can match the range of Przywara's erudition or the remarkable acuity of his intellect. If Przywara's extraordinary corpus of writings are astonishing, then no less astonishing are the numerous encounters and contacts he had with many of the leading philosophers, theologians, and writers of his generation. Przywara was truly a trailblazer in ecumenism, dialogue, and conversation, for he lived a life deeply in accord with Ignatian spirituality, that is, a life of service for the world that seeks to find the mystery of God in the concrete reality of the world. Thus, Przywara can be adequately summed up by what von Balthasar calls, when speaking about the life of Ignatius, a metaphysics of action. And one of the numerous ways he incarnated this metaphysics of action was via his numerous personal encounters with the varied thinkers of his day, be they Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, or non-confessional. Przywara then was immersed in the very center of that vibrant time of creative intellectual explosion that took place in Germany and Europe between the 2 world wars. I name some of the thinkers Przywara was in contact with: Edmund Husserl, Max Scheler, Martin Heidegger, Dietrich von Hildebrand, Martin Buber, Martin Grabmann, Romano Guardini, Karl Adam, Paul Tillich, Karl Barth, Karl Rahner, Hans Urs von Balthasar, and Edith Stein. It is not possible here to go into the intricate detail concerning the nature of Shivara's various intellectual encounters. However, I would like to mention his impact on, arguably, the three greatest theologians of the 20th century, namely Karl Barth, Hans Urs von Balthasar, and Karl Rahner. The best way to see this influence is to listen to the very words spoken by these intellectual giants. I begin with Karl Barth, who is certainly Shivara's most famous dialogue partner concerning the meaning and import of the Analogia Entis. This debate was made all the more famed by Barth's rhetorically passionate words. I regard the Analogia Entis as the invention of the Antichrist, and I believe that because of it, it is impossible ever to become a Catholic. Yet despite Barth's adamant nine to the Analogia Entis as a fundamental Catholic dink form, he still showed overwhelming respect and admiration for the person behind the creative rehabilitation of the Analogia Entis. This admiration is on full display in the following two quotes. He knows everything, everything which we think we know, except that always, right at the proper moment, he does not make use of it. The Catholic Church is becoming for me more and more the amazing phenomenon. In comparison, our Protestant opponents look very much like dwarfs, don't you think? This Jesuit was really something I had never seen before. He also told me that I am for him the opponent par excellence. He is a little man with a large head, but that does not mean he is not the giant Goliath incarnate. And again, my meetings with him in Münster and Bonn, the impression of his astonishing gift and art for being true to the world and his church, not only to understand everything, but to integrate it into his own ceaselessly penetrating and encouraging thinking, and still to remain in an exemplary way Catholic. This remains confirmed by so many exchanges, unforgettable. When Shivara received the Upper Silesian Cultural Prize in 1967, it was Karl Rahner who gave the laudatio. Rahner said, "Does this mean that the Catholic generation of today has learned what it had to learn from him, and now that is able to forget the old teacher, can continue nonchalantly to march along the path of the future of the Church without him? Without being a prophet, I feel compelled to say that we, the generation after him, as well as future generations, still have critical things to learn from him. The whole Shivara, especially the late Shivara, is yet to come. He stands at a place in the road that many in the Church have yet to get past." Rahner ends the laudatio with the words of von Balthasar. It is almost unthinkable that Shivara could have founded a school, but Shivara himself never reckoned with one. He remains an incomparable teacher. Every thinker should have to think through what he shows us, and yet he must content himself with letting those who have caught something of his fire to go their own way. Finally, von Balthasar, who is perhaps the greatest admirer of Shivara, described him as the greatest spirit I was ever permitted to meet, also has these praising words for Shivara. Shivara had long anticipated the opening of the Church to the world that came with the council, but he possessed in addition the corrective that has not been applied in the way that the council's teachings have been inflected and broadly put into practice, namely the elemental, downright Old Testament sense for the divinity of God, who is a consuming fire, a death-bringing sword, and a transporting love. Indeed, he alone possessed the language in which the word God could be heard without the touch of squeamishness that had led to the tepid, half-hearted talk of average theology today. He lives like a mythical salamander in the fire, there at the point where finite, creaturely being arises out of the infinite, where the indissoluble mystery holds sway, that he baptized with the name Analogia Entis. And lastly, von Balthasar says, ERICH enormous theological commission, in its depth and breadth not comparable to anyone else's in this time, might have been the decisive means of salvation for our Christian thinking today. The age chose the easier way not to engage him. We find in the above three quotes nothing other than the highest esteem, recognition, and admiration for Przywara as a person and thinker. Przywara, for Barth, Rahner, and von Balthasar, stood as a preeminent standard-bearer for philosophical and theological thinking. But if we are to heed the words of both Rahner and von Balthasar, then Przywara's thinking has something still to say to us today, at our present moment. The words of Rahner and von Balthasar must be taken up as a challenge to again show the dynamic vitality and need for Przywara's thought in a contemporary setting, and that is what I have sought to do in my reimagining the Analogia Entis, the future of ERICH Przywara's Christian vision. It is not possible here to enter the intricate and sophisticated metaphysical thickets of Przywara's imaginative reinterpretation of the Analogia Entis here. Instead, I would like to briefly look at the historical situation Przywara was facing and how his answer was to elevate the Analogia Entis into the fundamental Catholic think form. I will then conclude by situating Przywara within three Catholic responses to philosophical modernity in the 20th century, thereby alluding to his robust Christian vision. The great ERICH Przywara stood within a kairotic moment of decision concerning the direction and future of Catholic thought in the first part of the 20th century. What path was the Catholic thinker and church to take in face of the Goliath modernity, and more specifically, philosophical modernity? Was it to retreat into the bastions of a truncated and narrow-minded brand of Thomism, rejecting all things new as pernicious? Or was it to dissolve and reject the great treasures of the living Christian tradition in favor of all things new, as in modernism? Przywara's thinking then was situated within the powerful wake of the modernist integralist crisis, which, historically, became intertwined with the nature and interpretation of the neo-scholastic revival called for by Leo XIII. In other words, Przywara's thought world was one of crisis and transition, or better, it was a crossroad moment which concerned the fundamental approach, narrative, and metaphysical style of thinking that Christian thinking was to take vis-a-vis philosophical modernity amidst this time of radical Catholic self-questioning. Przywara's response to this moment of decision would mark him as one of the leading pioneers in Catholic thought at that time, due to his rejection of the closed dialectic of integralism, modernism, in favor of a dynamic, dialogical, and creative approach to Catholic thought. And he must be named as one of the leading, and in my view, the leading, Catholic intellectuals of that time. Przywara must then be mentioned along with other magisterial Catholic figures of that time who opened a genuine future for Christian discourse, such as Maurice Blondel, Pierre Rousselot, Romano Guardini, Joseph Marichal, Emile Mersch, and Karl Adam, to name some of the most prominent. Where then does the singularity and brilliance of Przywara's pioneering path in Catholic thought lie? And what distinguishes him from other leading Catholic figures of his day? The answer is found in Przywara's Christian speculative rehabilitation of the Analogia Entis. Yet why the Analogia Entis? In many circles, the term may sound like a rather arcane, dusty, out-of-date relic of a bygone past, fit only for specialists and ruminating armchair metaphysicians and theologians. Indeed, at the time that Przywara began his ascendancy as a leading Catholic thinker in Germany in the 1920s, this was precisely what the Analogia Entis was, namely a frozen, dusty terminus technicus of narrow-minded Baroque scholasticism, passed on in the commentarial tradition from the time of Cogitan onwards. But it was precisely Przywara who, in the words of Rahner, transmuted the Analogia Entis from a scholastic technicality into the fundamental structure of Catholic theology. Simply put, the reason that the Analogia Entis became, and still is, a point of metaphysical and theological contention is because it is centered in the basic and fundamental Catholic doctrine of the relation between God and creature, creation ex nihilo. In this, the Analogia Entis stands at the beginning of the Christian narrative of creation, incarnation, and redemption, and thus bespeaks and touches upon nearly every essential aspect of the Catholic narrative and doctrine. The Analogia Entis, interpreted thus, affects how one views the relation between philosophy and theology, and hence also natural theology, nature and grace, faith and reason, as well as the question of the extent of the effect of sin on human nature. However, the impact of the Analogia Entis does not stop there, but it reaches into Mariology, as Barth rightly saw, and thus implicates the question of the creature's openness to grace and its ability to receive the divine. Following from this, Christology is also importantly implicated in the range of influence of the Analogia Entis, insofar as it is able to explain, in a non-rationalistic sense, how the divine-human unity in the person of Christ weds creaturely logos with the divine logos, without confusion and separation. Nor does the sphere of the Analogia Entis end there, but passes on and over into the mystery of Trinitarian doctrine by protecting the distinction between the immanent and economic Trinity, while also speaking to Trinitarian relations. Further, the Analogia Entis is expressive of authentic Orthodox spirituality, insofar as it is rooted in an experience of God who is ever and always both in and beyond the experience of the creature. The Analogia Entis is thus expressive of a spirituality of humble submission and active service, which is respectful of the ever greater mystery of God's unsurpassable glory. If this list sounds daunting, it is. The Analogia Entis, as construed by Przywara, was interpreted as the fundamental Catholic think form. Przywara thus shows, like no thinker before or after him, how essential and necessary the Analogia Entis is to an integrated Catholic metaphysical grammar. As mentioned, Przywara stood within a crossroad moment of decision concerning the future direction of Catholic thought. Indeed, it has been seen that, for Rahner, Przywara stood at a place in the road that many in the Church have yet to get past. Further, von Balthasar provocatively stated that the work of Przywara might have been the decisive means of salvation for our Christian thinking today. Why then should Przywara's work be resurrected, and how can it be a decisive means for our Christian thinking in the 21st century? It is impossible to fully answer this question here. Rather, I would now like to show how the think form of the Analogia Entis of Przywara's thought is situated within various Catholic responses to philosophical modernity in the 20th century, and how his response is a robustly Christian answer to philosophical modernity. There have been, or are, as I see it, three principal paths proposed to move past this impasse within Catholic thought over the past century or so. The first is the natura pura tradition of Baroque scholasticism, which seeks to encounter philosophical modernity with its own rationalistic and autonomous reason, unaided by grace. In seeking to overcome the rationalism and autonomy of philosophical modernity, this approach uses the weapons of the enemy in a rather positivistic way, which strips it of its plurimatic Christian vision. This approach was the favored approach prior to Vatican II, but it is seen once again something of a revival today, especially in America, as a primary way for Catholic thinking to encounter philosophical modernity and contemporary questions. The second approach can be said to be the foundationalist transcendentalism of Rahner, which seeks to build the Christian faith on the turn to the subject, or in Rahner's famous words, "What is to be explained is the intrinsic possibility of intellectual knowledge as the place for a theological event." Such a task takes for granted the intrinsic compatibility between philosophical modernity and Christian revelation, and the need for revelation to be built upon the structure of the modern subject, which ends, I would argue, in a naturalization of the supernatural, which hobbles the Christian thinker's ability to speak within the gift of Christ's saving name. The third approach is seen in a renaissance of Christian reason enacted by du Lubac, von Balthasar, and Nouvelle Theologie thinkers in general. And it is within the trajectory of this last approach that Przywara's idiosyncratic work shares the greatest elective affinity. In his answer to philosophical modernity, this approach faces the project of philosophical modernity from within a plurimatic Christian vision of reality, which does not seek an accommodation within philosophical modernity, but also pursues a deep dialogue with philosophical modernity, which demands a radical discernment of spirits as to which aspects can be taken on board and which must be definitively rejected as antithetical to Christian vision. In doing, the criterion of judgment is a reading of all of history and metaphysics in light of the incarnation and the supernaturalization of the natural which took place within this unspeakable event. Przywara's Christian metaphysical vision of analogy demands us to confront the question of how seriously Catholic thought is taking the event of Christ. The first two approaches seek to face philosophical modernity in abstraction from this event, or less absolute, they minimize this event rather than maximalize it. Przywara says in refutation of this view, "A properly Christian perspective has the final word, for there is only one concretely existing world, the order between God and creature. In this concretely existing world, the order between original sin in Adam and redemption in Christ, the crucified. The concretely existing face of philosophy, every philosophy that is found within the concretely existing world and its history, is not visible except from the perspective of this order, within which, as an objectively universal order, every concretely existing human being stands, whether he knows it or not. Consequently, the question of the Christian philosophy is not the question of one particular philosophy among others within the ambit of philosophy as such. Rather, the question of the relation between Christianity and philosophy is the question concerning the concretely existing shape of philosophy as such within this single, concretely existing order that obtains between original sin in Adam and redemption in Christ." The answer to philosophical modernity for Przywara has to be a radically Christian answer, for there is simply no other order than that of sin and redemption wrought by Christ. There is no neutral sphere that could abstract itself from the revelation of Christ. Thus, all of Przywara's efforts in his speculative narrative of the Analogia Entis must be seen as a reducing all philosophical systems to the prius of the majesty of the triune Christian God of being and grace revealed through Christ. Metaphysics demands baptism for it to obtain its true relational and participatory status for the first time. Przywara, with his graced reason, broke open all finite truth, taking it captive for Christ, which is the seal of all genuine Christian thinking. Anonymity and the modern enlightened myth of a pure knowing are impossible. To paraphrase Eric Peterson, seen from the revelation of Christ, every kind of knowing is either Christian or anti-Christian, and this is what Przywara's Christian narrative of the Analogia Entis has to say in the face of philosophical modernity, namely, that all thinking is sealed or marked, and thus the only possible, indeed true answer is a thinking with the mind of Christ in the ecclesial reality of the totus Christus. This presentation has been unable to fully show how this connects with Przywara's rehabilitation of the Analogia Entis, but it is our hope that it will inspire the viewer to take up and read Przywara, thus proving Balthasar wrong, and that our age is no longer ignoring him, and that Rahner is right, that the whole of Przywara is yet to come. There is no doubt that interest in Przywara is rapidly growing, and my hope is that this ever-growing interest only continues. Thank you for taking the time to listen.